The sound was not of splintering wood but of shearing iron, a hard, final groan that traveled up from the earth and into the bones of her feet. Maeve stood beside the wagon, her hand still on the flank of the old black horse, and watched the left rear wheel cant inward at an impossible angle. The axle, a thick rod of forged iron that had carried her family west, had fractured. It hung now like a broken limb, useless. The horse, shifted his weight but did not startle. He was old and had learned the futility of panic. He simply stood, his breath pluming in the unnervingly still air, and waited for her to decide what came next. She looked not at the broken wagon but at the sky. It was a strange, bruised yellow at the horizon, a color that held no warmth. The air itself felt thin and sharp in her lungs, scrubbed clean of dust and life. There was no wind, but the silence felt like a held breath, a pressure waiting to be released. She had seen a sky like this once before, years ago. Her father had stopped the team, his face grim as he studied the flat, endless line where the prairie met the world. "That ain't weather," he had said, his voice low. "That's a warning." Maeve ran a chapped hand over the rough canvas of the wagon cover, the fabric her mother had patched a dozen times. Inside was everything that remained: a sack of flour, a small crate of hardtack, 2 blankets, a tin of coffee, and the tools her father had kept meticulously oiled. It was a poor inheritance, and now it was stranded in a shallow basin of flint and withered grass, miles from any track or sign of settlement. The cold was beginning to deepen, sinking into her wool coat not as a gradual chill but as a physical weight. Nudged her shoulder with his nose, a soft, questioning gesture. She leaned her forehead against his neck, breathing in the scent of horse and leather. The stillness of the landscape was a lie. Something was coming. She could feel it in the way the light was failing, not with the gentle fade of dusk but as if a shutter were slowly closing over the sun. She left the wagon where it lay broken. There was no fixing the axle here, not with the tools she had and not with the time the sky was giving her. Her only task now was to find shelter. She took Ub's reins, his familiar weight in her hand, a small, solid anchor in the vast emptiness. They moved slowly, her eye scanning the low, rolling contours of the land. It was poor country, offering little more than shallow dips and the occasional cluster of rock outcroppings, weathered into smooth, unhelpful shapes. Most were too exposed, offering no real lee from the wind she knew was coming. She walked with a steady, ground-eating pace, a rhythm learned over 1,000 miles of following the wagon. She did not look back. The wagon was a fact, like the coming storm. Looking back changed neither. After an hour, as the yellow light began to curdle into a grim, violet grey, she saw it. It was not a cave, not even a proper shelter. It was a flaw in the landscape, a deep hollow gouged out of a low rock ledge, perhaps by the spring melt of 1,000 forgotten years. The opening was a wide, shallow crescent, maybe 20 feet across and no more than 8 feet deep at its center. Above, a thick overhang of stone jutted out, its surface scoured smooth by wind. It was a scoop out of the world, a place where the wind would have to fight to enter. Sam, the old trapper who had traveled with them for a season, had told her once, his voice rough as bark. "Don't look for a house. The wild don't build houses. Look for a pocket. A place the wind can't find." This was a pocket. It was open and exposed, but its shape was right. The rock face would be a solid back wall, and the overhang a roof of sorts. The front was the problem. The front was a gaping mouth open to the coming storm. She led Ub into the hollow. The air inside was instantly calmer, the profound silence of the plains amplified by the stone. The horse lowered his head, his ears relaxed for the first time since the axle had broken. He trusted the place. Maeve ran her hand along the cold, granular surface of the rock. It was solid. It would hold. Now she needed to find a front wall. Her gaze turned back across the dimming prairie, toward the dark shape of the crippled wagon. It was wreckage. It was failure. And it was all she had. The work of moving the wagon was a brutal lesson in physics. She could not move it whole. First, she unhitched Ub, freeing him from the harness he had worn for weeks. The leather was stiff with cold, the buckles biting at her numb fingers. Then began the slow, torturous process of dismantling her home. She used the pry bar from her father's tool chest to work the wagon box free from the undercarriage. The wood groaned in protest, the sound loud in the oppressive quiet. She worked methodically, her movements economical, wasting nothing. Every nail she managed to pull straight was saved, tucked into a leather pouch at her belt. Every board that came free was a potential piece of her new wall. The sun had vanished completely now, leaving only a faint, luminous stain in the west. The first snowflakes began to fall, not the soft, drifting kind, but tiny, hard grains like sand, driven by a rising wind that moaned over the lip of the basin. It was a searching wind, a thief's wind, looking for a way in. With Abe's help, she dragged the heavy wagon box across the frozen ground. She looped ropes around the frame, tying them to the pommel of her saddle, and urged the old horse to pull. He strained, his muscles bunching, his hooves scrabbling for purchase on the flinty soil. The box moved in agonizing increments, its broken side carving a deep scar in the earth. It took hours. The snow was coming faster now, a white veil that blurred the edges of the world. By the time she had the wagon box positioned at the mouth of the rock hollow, her body ached with a deep, shuddering fatigue. Her hands were raw, her breath coming in ragged bursts. But the first piece of the wall was in place. She had turned the wagon on its side, its high, solid flank facing the wind, creating a barrier nearly 5 feet tall that blocked off the center of the hollow's opening. The wind hit it with a dull thud, deflected by the solid oak. It was a start. But there were still huge gaps on either side, dark mouths that invited the storm. The wagon box was the spine of her shelter. Now she had to build the ribs. She used the pry bar and a small hand axe to break apart the wagon's undercarriage. The wheels were a problem. They were heavy, dense with iron and seasoned hardwood. She managed to wrestle one off, rolling it into the gap between the wagon box and the left side of the rock wall. It was a clumsy fit, but it filled most of the space. She packed smaller rocks and clods of frozen earth into the gaps around it, the dirt-like chunks of stone in her hands. The wind was a solid wall of force now, driving the snow horizontally. It screamed over the rock ledge above her, a sound of tearing fabric on a colossal scale. She worked in the lee of her growing wall, the relative calm a small, precious thing. The other 3 wheels she left. They were too heavy, the work to free them too costly in time and energy. Instead, she turned her attention to the wagon's canvas cover. It was heavy, oilcloth-treated canvas, stiff and unwieldy in the cold. It took all her strength to pull it free from the wagon's frame and drag it toward the shelter. The wind caught it immediately, turning it into a monstrous, thrashing sail. It nearly pulled her off her feet, the canvas snapping and booming like cannon fire. She fell to her knees, clinging to one edge, the fabric a living thing trying to escape. She remembered her father teaching her to sail a small boat on the wide, muddy river they had left behind. "Don't fight the whole sail," he'd said. "Just fight the corner you're holding. Make one piece of it obey you." She focused on one corner, crawling on her hands and knees, dragging it to the rock face and piling a heavy stone on it. Then another. And another. She worked her way along the edge, pinning the canvas down, taming it one small section at a time until it lay flat on the ground. The storm was no longer coming. It had arrived. With the foundation of the wall in place, the true work of sealing the shelter began. The gaps that remained were irregular and treacherous. The wind, denied the main entrance, now forced its way through every crack and seam with a vicious, whistling intensity. It was a physical presence, a searching cold that stole the heat from her bones. She took the large canvas top and began the painstaking process of stretching it across the entire structure. She draped it over the top of the overturned wagon box, over the wedged-in wheel, and anchored the edges with the heaviest rocks she could find and carry. The canvas bucked and pulled, the wind getting underneath it, trying to tear it from her grasp. Each rock placed was a victory. She wove ropes through the grommets along the edge of the canvas, tying them to the wagon frame, to the wheel spokes, to small, hardy shrubs growing near the rock face. Her fingers, long past numb, fumbled with the knots. She tied them by feel, the muscle memory of 100 lessons from Sam guiding her. He had been a man of few words, but his hands were eloquent. A knot is a promise, he'd told her, cinching a diamond hitch. Make a promise that holds. She made promises in the dark, the rope stiff as wire, her breath freezing in the air before her. The snow was accumulating rapidly, a fine, stinging dust that found its way into her eyes and down the collar of her coat. She could feel the weight of it beginning to build on the canvas roof. She worked faster, her movements fueled by a cold, clear-eyed fear. The fear was not a panic, it was a tool, sharpening her focus, driving her to see the next gap, the next weakness, before the storm could exploit it. She was no longer building a wall. She was mending a seam against the end of the world. The largest gaps were plugged, but the shelter was still porous. The wind was a hunter, and it was finding every small hole. Fine powder snow, like sifted flour, streamed in through a dozen tiny fissures. She had to make the shelter airtight. She dragged the splintered floorboards from the wagon into the hollow, wedging them into the remaining spaces, their jagged ends fitting together like crude puzzle pieces. She used the driver's seat, its leather cracked and worn, to block a triangular hole near the ground. She took the empty grain sacks and went back out into the teeth of the storm, scooping them full of snow and dirt, packing the mixture down until the sacks were dense, heavy blocks. She stacked these like bricks, filling the spaces the wood could not. Her father's tool chest, filled with the comforting, solid weight of his hammers and wrenches, became the final cornerstone, plugging the last major opening. She brought Ob deeper into the hollow, his large body a welcome source of warmth and a final, living barrier against the elements. He stood quietly, his head low, accepting the strange, cramped darkness. Now, she turned to the details. She took the 2 wool blankets and stuffed them into the cracks between the wagon box and the rock wall, the soft fabric choking off the whistling drafts. She used her mother's sewing kit, not for thread, but for the small awl, using it to push scraps of cloth and leather into the tiniest of seams. The interior of the shelter grew quieter. The roar of the blizzard was still there, a constant, deafening pressure on the outside of the canvas and wood, but inside, the high-pitched screams of the wind were gone. The air became still. It was a dead, frigid stillness, but it was hers. She had built it from wreckage. The snow was piling up against the outer wall now, not a threat, but a new ally. Each flake that landed added to the insulation, sealing her in, burying her shelter from the searching wind. She had made a pocket in the storm, and now the storm itself was helping to close the door. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the darkness inside the shelter and the sound. The sound was a constant, deep-throated roar, a physical pressure that vibrated through the rock and the wood, a noise so immense it felt like the world was tearing itself apart. But it was a muffled roar. The sharp edges of the wind shrieking had been blunted by her walls. Inside, there was a different set of sounds, the soft, rhythmic huff of Ob's breathing, the occasional shift of his hooves on the stone floor, the sound of her own heart beating a slow, steady drum in her ears. She sat with her back against the cold, unyielding rock, her legs pulled up to her chest, one of the thin blankets draped over her shoulders. The cold was absolute. It was a presence in the dark, a thing that leached warmth from any exposed surface. Her water canteen was already frozen solid. She broke off a piece of hardtack and chewed it slowly, the dry crumbs scraping her throat. It was not food, it was fuel. It was the work of staying alive. Time lost its meaning. There was no sun, no moon, only the varying intensity of the storm's rage outside. She did not sleep. She could not afford to. Sleep was a thief that would steal the last of her body's heat. Instead, she entered a state of watchful stillness. She would run her hands over the interior of her makeshift wall, feeling for new drafts, for the telltale trickle of fine snow that signaled a breach. She would listen to the breathing of the horse, his life a steady counterpoint to the chaos outside. He was her furnace, his large body radiating a small, vital pocket of warmth into the crushing cold. Hours bled into one another. She thought of her mother, not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with a quiet, hollow ache. She remembered the scent of baking bread, the feel of her mother's hand brushing the hair from her face. These memories were not comforts. They were ghosts, reminders of a warmth that no wall could ever provide. The work wasn't the building. She heard Sam's voice in her memory, clear as if he were sitting beside her in the dark. That's the easy part. The real work is the waiting. The waiting was a form of labor. It required a constant, vigilant rationing of energy, of hope, of thought itself. To let her mind wander too far was to invite despair, and despair was an indulgence that would cost her everything. So she focused on the immediate, the physical. She broke off small pieces of ice from the mouth of her canteen and let them melt on her tongue, a slow and painful way to hydrate. She shared her meager supply of hardtack with Ob, who lipped the dry biscuit from her palm with a gentle trust that felt like a heavy responsibility. The horse was the anchor of her sanity. His calm presence was a rebuke to the howling madness outside. She would talk to him, her voice a low murmur that was swallowed by the dark. "Easy, Ob." Just a little longer. The words were for herself as much as for him. At some point, she felt a fine, cold powder settling on her cheek. She sat bolt upright, her lethargy vanishing in a surge of adrenaline. A leak! She crawled on her hands and knees, her palms sweeping across the canvas and wood, searching for the source. She found it near the top of the wagon box, where the canvas had pulled away just enough to admit a tiny, persistent stream of snow. The wind had found a flaw. She couldn't fix it from the outside. She took her father's smallest whetstone from the tool pouch, its smooth, oiled surface cold against her skin, and wedged it into the gap, twisting it until it plugged the hole. It was a small, desperate repair, a finger in a dike. But it held. The flow of snow stopped. She retreated to her spot against the wall, her body trembling not from cold, but from the effort. She had won a small battle in the long, silent war. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light, it was her entire world. The textures of the wall, the rough grain of the wood, the slick, cold canvas, the gritty feel of frozen dirt, were her only landmarks. She existed in a space defined by touch and sound, a sealed pocket of life buried in a world of white fury. The change, when it came, was not sudden. It was a slow alteration in the character of the sound. The deep, guttural roar of the blizzard began to lose its vibrato. The relentless, high-pitched screaming that had been the storm's voice for what felt like an eternity subsided into a low, mournful moan. It was still a formidable sound, the sound of immense power, but it no longer felt like an attack. The searching, clawing pressure against her shelter eased. Maeve remained perfectly still, listening. She had learned to read the land and the sky, and now she was learning to read the language of the storm. This was not the end, but it was a shift. It was the sound of a beast that had exhausted its rage and was now settling into a vast, weary sulk. She waited. Another hour passed, or perhaps 3. Time was still a fluid, unknowable thing. Then she noticed another change. Through a tiny, pinprick-sized hole in the canvas, a single point of light appeared. It was not the bright, clear light of day, but a diffuse, milky luminescence. It was enough. It was a sign that the sky was no longer a solid, churning mass of grey. The world outside was still buried, but it was no longer being actively erased. She did not move to break her seal. Sam had taught her that, too. He had been caught in a plains blizzard once, holed up in a sod dugout for 3 days. The storm has 2 deaths, he had warned. The first is the wind. The second is the cold it leaves behind. The wind makes you hide. The quiet cold is what kills you when you come out thinking you're safe. She would wait for the sun. She would wait for a sign of its warmth, however faint. She leaned her head back against the rock, the single point of light a distant star in her small, dark universe. The worst was over. She had met the fury of the storm and her broken, patchwork shelter had held. The stillness inside her hollow was no longer a fragile, desperate creation. It was a victory. She gave it another full cycle of what she guessed was day and night. The light from the pinhole brightened and then faded back to nothing, and the sound of the wind diminished to a whisper, then to silence. The only sound was the drip of melting ice somewhere inside the shelter. When the pale light returned, stronger this time, she knew it was time. The cold was still a profound and dangerous presence, but the violence had passed. She began the slow, methodical process of deconstruction. It was harder than the building. The snow had drifted up against the outside of her wall, cementing it in place with a weight of tons. She could not move the wagon box. She could not shift the wheel. She had sealed herself in too well. For a moment, a sliver of true panic, cold and sharp, pierced her exhaustion. To survive the storm only to be entombed by its aftermath was an irony too cruel to contemplate. But the panic subsided, replaced by the familiar, steady habit of thought. She had built it. She could unbuild it. She went to the section of wall she had made from the stacked sacks of dirt and snow. They were frozen solid, hard as rock. She took the pry bar, her father's most useful tool, and began to chip away at the frozen seams. It was grueling work. Each blow sent a jarring shock up her arms. Flakes of frozen dirt and ice rained down. She worked for an hour, creating a small opening, then a larger one, until she had carved a hole big enough to wriggle through. She pushed her head out and was blinded. The world was a single, unbroken expanse of white under a pale, thin sun. The light was dazzling, reflecting off the snow with an intensity that hurt her eyes. The silence was absolute. It was a clean, dead world. The top of the wagon box was just visible, a dark ridge in a sea of white. Her shelter was a mound, a new feature of the landscape, a burial drift. She crawled out, her boots sinking deep into the powder. Up followed, blinking in the sudden, shocking brightness. They stood together, two small, dark figures in a vast, white emptiness. She looked at the horizon, at the clean, hard line where the new snow met the pale blue sky. She had not conquered the storm. She had simply endured it. She had built a pocket of stillness and waited for the world to stop screaming. She turned back to the mound, to the wreckage she had transformed into life. The knowledge was in her hands, in her bones now. It was a hard, cold lesson, paid for in loss. She took Ab's reins, the leather cold in her hand, and began to walk south, leaving the broken wagon buried behind her.